Just one more thing.
All good.
Sure, that works.
Okay, we are live. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. This is Alexandra Litton Regalado coming to you from San Salvador. Today has been a very strange and windy, kind of like moody day, sort of end of the world is coming. And so it's kind of perfect that we're having this book presentation tonight with Ruben Reyes. Hi, Ruben.
Hi, thanks for having me. Logging in from Queens, New York.
Excellent, excellent. So the channel you're watching is the Salvadoran Cultural Institute, La Casa de Cultura El Salvador. We are a nonprofit organization entirely composed by volunteers. We are not a government agency. Our mission is to educate, celebrate, and promote the arts, culture, and achievements of El Salvador and Salvadorans in the diaspora. So tonight we're going to be talking to Ruben Reyes Jr., who's the son of two Salvadoran immigrants and the author of There's a Rio Grande in Heaven. He's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop in Harvard College. His writing has appeared in the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, Lightspeed Magazine, and other publications. And he's originally from Southern California, and now he's a new homeowner or apartment owner in Queens. Tonight's presentation will be done mostly, or I think entirely, in English. And it will also be recorded and you'll be able to watch it again or share it through our YouTube channel. Ruben's bio and his webpage are going to be available to you on the comments also, so you can learn more about him and his upcoming projects. Speaking of upcoming projects, Ruben has been telling me, and Lucia de Sola, who is with us tonight, she is also part of Casa de la Cultura and Efraín Caravantes. I don't know if you all want to come in and say hello. Hi, Lucia. And Efra's there working his magic in the background. When Ruben was telling us earlier that he is working on a novel, and when do we expect to see that out?
I can tell you that it'll be next summer. I just saw the cover. So waiting on an official date and an official announcement. But yeah, soon, sometime in the next year.
Very, very exciting. If it's anything as good as this book, I can't tell you how much I recommend it.
Thank you.
Debut book. There's a Rio Grande in Heaven. I was lucky enough to read one of the advanced copies when I had lunch with Ruben some time ago, and he shared it with me, and I was really excited. It's a collection of 12 short stories and flash fiction. It's published by Mariner Books of HarperCollins, and it's been described as an electrifying debut story collection about Central American identity that spans past, present, and future worlds to reveal what happens when your life is no longer your own. I think I've been doing a lot of research and reading all of your interviews and different essays and articles that have been published about your work. And I found it very interesting how you posed this question. You said, how can fiction help us make sense of the real life dystopia Central American immigrants face every day? There's a Rio Grande in Heaven is my way of working through that question. I really feel like every Salvadoran and Central American should read this book. I found it to be inventive, charged, funny, and incisive, disturbing, and sometimes even devastating. That last story, which I hope you'll share with us tonight, one of the alternative history series that you dedicate to Valeria and Oscar Martinez, is just like stab and twist. You know, that repetition of the line that becomes an invocation and a prayer. There's a Rio Grande in heaven. The title is just yes, yes, yes. So good, so good.
Thank you.
Um, and so I want to talk a little bit about the atmosphere in which you began to write this book. You describe it
Yeah.
as satirical, surreal, and a little bit absurd. And you're saying that you wrote this during the Trump presidency, and you wanted to bring attention to the systems that were allowing for these injustices to take place. So it's a book that hones in on capitalism and technology, xenophobia, and greed. And I really love the dark humor. Um, there's so much play involved, right? And there's like robots and dinosaurs and a reggaetonero, and all the titles are so inventive and curious, like quiero perrear and other catastrophes. Tell us about the general atmosphere that you were kind of surrounded with when you started writing this book.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the earliest story was from the summer of 2016, which was obviously when Trump was kicking off, his I guess he had already kicked it off and he was really honing in on his xenophobic message and his campaign. And then I think the last story probably was drafted in 2021. And so, basically the length of the Trump presidency was when I was writing these stories. And I was seeing just some of the most heartbreaking and infuriating, conversations happening on the national stage. Obviously, as we know, immigration from El Salvador has been happening for centuries at this point. Since the country was founded, basically. But it only kind of gets the American public's attention selectively. And I was writing these stories at a time where there was a lot of attention on Central America. And so I wanted to write in conversation with that kind of political moment. But I wanted to do it at a slant, at an angle, at a way that would still be entertaining, both to me as a writer. Maybe entertaining is the wrong word, but at least interesting to me as a writer, and hopefully to a reader, which is why there are so many sci-fi conceits, which is why there's a good amount of levity and humor, along with the really, I think, clear political message that is at the heart of a lot of these stories. Yeah.
I wonder also, because I want to get to hearing one of you. We're going to hear hopefully two, if not three, short sections or short stories. But I do have a question because for those people that are tuning in right now, this is a book where our real world really feels dystopian as it is. Like it's almost like you don't have to make these things up.
Yeah.
um and you said, right, all science fiction is actually a reflection of our world. And I thought a lot about that because thinking about what it must feel, for an immigrant to have to abandon everything that they know, cross the desert and enter a strange new land where they don't know the language and where they're unwelcome. you know it's that's already enough, a strangeness, putting someone on another planet almost.
Yeah.
So I wonder, explain to me, like, why science fiction? Why did you choose to set these stories in the future? And how does that for you reflect the immigrant experience?
Yeah. I mean, the first part is just, that I loved science fiction growing up. It was what I was reading and, what I'm still kind of obsessed with. The Jurassic Park movies have gotten maybe a little bit worse in their quality, but I still go to the theater and I watch them. There's this like childhood love of everything sci-fi and fantasy that I still hold on to. So that's part of the reason. Um, The other part of the reason is that I'm really drawn to fiction that's about ideas, and systems. And I found that science fiction was a way of really dealing with systems because, as you mentioned, there are these dynamics in our real world that can then become a metaphor or an allegory, or, can be looked or just at least dissected through in a story. So like you mentioned, the immigrant experience of coming to a new land feels like something that could be in a first encounter space sci-fi story. Um, and so I found that the science fiction conceits at least let me get to the heart of the questions I was asking, which are all questions about our world and about the way that Central American immigrants are devalued and dehumanized. So yeah, it's both a craft reason and also kind of a personal, intuitive, personal reason.
Not to get too, deep into this topic because of the actual situation that we live in, but, I feel like, with the certain limitations that we have in our freedom of expression, it almost feels as if to tell the truth, we need to speak in parables and fables and us, set everything in kind of like a surreal world, uh and that's kind of like fascinating and also horrifying at the same time, no?
Yeah,
Um,
no, I totally agree. It's also for me a way of making the systems and the world as we know it seem fresh again. I feel like we're so desensitized to what's happening because we've been living with it for so long. Or in the case of like our prejudices, for example, those are so ingrained to us that we take them as truth. And kind of, I think of it like I think of my stories as kind of refracting reality rather than reflecting reality. Um, by playing around, in these kind of fabulistic or satirical realms, I'm able to like make the systems that we kind of take for granted visible again.
yeah.
At least that's my hope and my goal with the stories. Yeah.
But what's really amazing? It's like, they're set in these like other worlds and like, with all this kind of technology that doesn't exist. I'm still super impressed with the way that you represent your characters with such fairness and compassion. um the stories all feel really human, and so you're talking about systems and like addressing all of these really important things related to violence and oppression and subjugation, but it doesn't really feel like you're being sermonized, like you're not receiving a sermon, and you're not also like you're not lecturing to the reader. and
Mhm.
and it's really interesting also because you've managed to keep the story, like you can really just get lost in the story and really feel like you are inhabiting the bodies of these characters. um how'd you learn to do that? It's
Oh my
really
gosh.
hard.
Thank you for saying that. It is really hard. Character is honestly one of the craft things I struggle with the most. Just because I think I come to my fiction, at least my short stories, kind of concept first. I usually have this concept or this like political question that I'm trying to answer or at least work through, if not answer. Um, and character is usually like the second or third thing that kind of comes in. And in edits, I really have to like focus on my interiority, writing character description, giving them texture. A lot of these things, they just don't come that naturally to me. Um, and so it's a lot of work, but the reason I do it and the reason why I think it's important is because it is the stuff that makes, in my opinion, fiction different than a lot of different other kinds of storytelling. I think of all the novels I loved growing up, in addition to the sci-fi ones, there's like sci-fi on one end that sometimes has, some of it has like pretty shallow characterization because that's not the important thing. On the other hand, I was reading quiet literary fiction, right? And like that is all about interiority, it's all about character dynamics. Um, and those books were honestly some of the most immersive for me. And so, I knew I had to bring some of that into here. Which is why I like to think of this book as kind of a blend of the kind of pulpy sci-fi and then the quiet domestic lit fic that I also loved. But it's hard. It's really hard, and I work hard at it actually to make it work. Yeah.
Bueno, I think it's wonderful. And on that note, why don't we hear one of your stories so that the public, el público, can get a taste.
Okay, vamos. This one is I'm gonna read. There's a series of flash fiction pieces, short pieces around 1,000 words. I don't exactly know that they're all up under 1,000. And they share a title. And the title is An Alternate History of El Salvador, Perhaps the World. And this is the first one. The Spanish ships leave their docks, but there is no crash landing, no savior knocking at the isthmus's shore, only civilization as it was and continues to be. A tempest thrashes La Niña around as men fall off her side in a choir of shrieks and prayers. An empire-sized wave swells and crashes down on La Pinta, splintering the cork oak frame and pine planks. The Santa Maria sinks, full of salty sweet water, until it sits on the ocean floor. Bottom feeders nibble on dead Spaniard skin. Another attempt, decades later. This is how the story goes. Thousands of pipil stand before the Spanish soldiers with spears in their hands, obsidian blades pointed toward the rain clouds as they prepare for a battle that will determine who stays and who leaves this land they know as Cuscatlan or San Salvador, one named Spanish, one named true. The Spanish are on horses, the pipil on foot, and the air soon fills with the sound of gunfire and screams, the battlefield soaked in gunpowder and horse blood. The pipil soldiers find themselves on the precipice of defeat. Enslavement is almost guaranteed. Their skin branded with a red-hot iron, their bodies shipped to a land other than this. They fight, though their cotton armor is soaked and heavy. Outmanned, losing men by the second, they continue swinging and jabbing. Mud makes their dark skin darker. Then the clouds shift. The rain intensifies, each droplet expanding into a heavy orb. In the deluge, a pipil soldier sees an opening and lunges forward. The Spanish army commander's hair sticks to his forehead as he falls from his horse, pierced in the side by a spear tip. He tumbles into the quagmire, and his blood mixes with brown water. If he doesn't die there, an infection will inevitably kill him. The Pipil win the battle, and the Spanish never return. 1524 marks a continuation. The year signifies neither murderous start nor massacred end. Onward, forevermore. The coast is quiet. Death is just a part of the rainforest life cycle, a cosmic part of Earth's give and take. There is no war, no aftermath, no nation, no blood or sweat or singed skin in the dirt.
That's really beautiful. And bueno, this all of these alternate histories, I think they're brilliant. It's so like interesting, that like kind of like yearning, and also, I imagine you must have had to do some sort of, research for this, like their cotton
Yeah,
armor. I think about details like that. Um, and you know what? I also thought of, and I know she's a friend of yours, Janelle Pineda's poem In Another Life.
I love
That,
that poem. Yeah,
yeah, I love how
yeah,
that also kind of like sparks that other kind of like alternate history, because I think for so many of us that are immigrants, the war is always part of our origin story. Because of that, our parents left, and because of that, some of you were born in the US. And so I think that it's really beautiful that your book, begins not with the Civil War, but with, this other instance in history that was also very, important in who we are today, as a kind of origin story to open the book. It's really smart.
yeah. Thank you.
Um, did you do research for this?
Yeah, I mean, I've been studying El Salvador, since college, when I realized that there was so much I didn't know. I grew up going to El Salvador, so I knew Santa Tecla and I knew the Colonia, where my dad grew up. I knew my grandma's farm in San Vicente. Uh, but I didn't know that there was a broader, like I never thought to think that there was a broader history, a broader culture, which sounds silly now, but I think partially it was youth and part of it was that I grew up in the US where Salvadoran stories are marginalized and sometimes hard to access. And so in college, I wanted to learn everything I could about El Salvador, and some of these alternate histories are an offshoot of just different threads that I followed at different times. Um, there's another story that kind of revolves a little bit around La Matanza. This one's obviously about the kind of first encounter with Spaniards in what is now El Salvador. Uh, yeah, so I did a lot of general research and that finds its way. And I'm such a history guy that I have to write about it in some way, even in my fiction.
That's great. Let's see. I think that another thing that was really exciting for me to read this book is the specificity, no? Like, to read about, just to see El Salvador, the name of our country and Salvadorans and kind of like, you know, bueno, the mango story. We can talk about that. And I know Lucia, who's with us, also had a question about the cover, and how certain things, like will not be as good as like the mango that we have in our backyard. And so I think that was another one of the really thrilling elements of this book is to find all of those elements of El Salvador present through all of the pages. And so like, the more the more thrilling it is, and the things that you are left questioning, the more you want to look into and kind of mull, and think about and take in. Um, Lucia, do you want to ask Ruben about the cover? Like you said, you're intrigued.
Yes. Good night, everyone. Good night, Ruben. Good evening, rather. It's great to have you here with us. I love the cover and I wanted to hear more about it. I wanted to hear about the artist. I wanted to hear about your take on it. Um,
Yeah. Definitely.
in
I'm also
general,
I love the cover as well. I feel so lucky and my publisher has been really just fantastic partner in that whole conversation. The illustration is by Maria Jesus Contreras, who is a Chilean artist. And if you guys don't follow her on Instagram, you should. She has just like the most whimsical and like nostalgic, but also playful kind of art. Um, and that's kind of what we have here. Um, when I started having a conversation with my editor about the cover, I knew a couple things. I knew I wanted bright colors. I wanted something that was really going to pop and be approachable. There's a lot of heaviness in this book, but there is also this playfulness that Alex mentioned. Um, and so I wanted the cover to kind of capture that. And I think that the knife, is that little bit of that edginess, but the colors are a little bit of the playfulness. Um, and then as far as the mango, I don't know that the mango story is the first full story in the collection, which obviously means it has a really special place in my heart. Um, and so that was part of the reasoning for that, I think. And also just like this story is so much about like symbols and my relationship to El Salvador, in weird subtle ways. And I feel like fruit is one of those things that not just Salvadorans, I think a lot of diasporic writers kind of reflect and think a lot about. And so I wanted to use that image, but I wanted that kind of weirdness of the cover to also show that there's something beneath it too. Um, yeah, I don't know. I love it. I love it, and she's amazing, and yeah.
You know what it reminded me
great.
of? I think it's super kitsch and like it did remind me of those books, the choose your own adventure books that I used to read when I was a kid. And then, you round up your book with a choose your own adventure kind of story. And I'm really curious about that. Can you walk us through that decision and how that story structure became kind of like part of your exploration into an immigrant's sense of agency?
Yeah, totally. Um, Something I found out pretty soon after I decided I want to write about immigrants, was kind of a paradox that I was facing. And I've written an essay about this if anyone's curious. Um, you could find it on LitHub. But basically, the paradox I was facing was that immigrants are people both with agency and that they get to make, they're humans like anyone else, so they get to make choices that have consequences, but they're also marginalized in society, right? And by our immigration system and by the forces that often force them to leave their homes. And so their agency is obviously lessened by these things. And so I needed to figure out how to write in a way that both, you know, gave them the agency they have that makes them human, but also acknowledges the way that systems take away their agency. And as I was thinking about this in general, I was talking to a friend who had mentioned Choose Your Own Adventure stories and the fact that she was trying to write one. And it kind of clicked. And I was like, oh my God, that sounds like such a great challenge. And it kind of answered for me this question about how you write about someone with limited agency, basically. And so in that story, it's more specifically about a child migrant, which I think is even more than an adult, someone with limited agency just by nature of being a child. And it allowed me to basically bring attention to this kind of position that immigrants find themselves in by dropping the reader into the place of the child, both the child and also the choice maker at once. Yeah, it was one way basically of solving this dilemma I was facing.
I read that essay and I found it really beautiful where you ask, how do you write a hero's journey for someone who's seldom seen as a hero? And you say, even the most empathetic reader cannot guarantee the protagonist a happy ending, as much as they might want to, and as thoughtfully as they choose. For immigrants, too many paths lead to hunger, death, and unhappiness. That's really on the spot. And so it is crazy and so accurate that this kind of like playful speculative game is actually really making it, underlining that inability to choose, certain things. um yeah, it was really stunning. So how about we hear another story?
Yeah, let's do another one. Let's see. I'm gonna read the next one in the series. This one, like I said, shares the same title, An Alternate History of El Salvador, Perhaps the World. And this is the story I mentioned that kind of circles La Matanza. The bones were found by accident, but the Salvadoran government wasted no opportunity. The Minister of Culture sent a telegram to the national press, and though the journalist tasked with writing the article had more questions, the official refused to elaborate. Swallowing his concerns like a spoonful of cough syrup, the journalist wrote the story he was instructed to. The bones had been excavated as part of a broader attempt to preserve the country's cultural patrimony. The president had decreed the dig, and though no one had expected bones, that's what paleontologists discovered. In the land of volcanoes, they'd found a dinosaur. It was a feat of archaeology. Almost all the bones were intact, and the museum in the capital would be able to display them all together, bringing the long-dead predator from the Cretaceous back to life. His teeth were rumored to be as large as a child's forearm. He must have towered above where the anona trees grazed the sky. El Salvador was a growing, peaceful, united nation. Patriotic citizens had uncovered evidence of an equally powerful and grandiose ancestor. When the fossilized skeleton demanded a name, the choice was obvious. No name was more appropriate for such a majestic beast, one whose bones would be proof of the nation's importance. Maximilian, wow, I can never pronounce it even though I read it. Maximiliano Don, a mouthful, but appropriate. The etymology, teeth like the general, teeth like the president, teeth, glorious teeth. President Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez reportedly loved the name and felt honored that a piece of national history would be his namesake. His teeth were not quite as large as the dinosaurs, he joked at a state dinner, but he wasn't afraid to bite if things got ugly. He was a military man, after all. Drawing a little bit of blood once in a while was part of the job. Once the bones had been fully extracted and cleaned, they had to be transported to the capital. They were carefully loaded into trucks, secured with a combination of rope, bricks, and sandbags that would ensure the bones shifted as little as possible. The truck beds were covered with sturdy canvas tarps that made the fossils look like a badly wrapped gift. Large stretches of highway were worn down and patchy, so the bones only moved a few dozen miles a day. The morning before the drivers left, state-sponsored newspapers published the route. The headline read, "Come see the bones while you can." And people did. They scurried from their adobe homes, nestled among trees and next to plots of land they farmed for larger, richer families, and found their way to the bit of road the trucks would glide past on. Everyone wanted a view of the monstrous dinosaur, especially since most couldn't afford a day off or a ride to the city. The procession was well attended, drawing crowds as large as those that gathered during Holy Week and the Christmas holidays. People stood by, whooping as the procession went by, even though the dusty tarp obscured their vision. Observers filled their heads with their own ideas of what the dinosaur looked like, their imagination revealing what remained hidden from them. A group of pious farmers decided to follow the trucks, hoping they'd see the bones at some point. If they didn't start barefoot, their shoes soon fell apart. The bottoms of their feet split and hardened as they followed the procession, which continued to move glacially. By the time the bones arrived at the capital, where an expensive spectacle of a celebration was held, the caravan of followers had dissipated. None made it to the homecoming. As exciting and well publicized as the bones were, there were people who knew the truth. Even those with the resources to reach a broad audience couldn't broadcast it. It was 1941. The memory of the massacre 9 years prior was still in sight. Terror hid and rewrote details about everything, including the discovery. A clumsy crew of men had found the bones by mistake as they sought to uproot and flatten the land on which a railroad would be built. It was a stroke of luck, though the public would never know. Pipil and Lenca workers from the closest coffee plantation unearthed and cleaned the bones. It hurt to know that the bones were familiar, family to some, as they refashioned them to resemble a monster's body. They loaded them on the truck and then returned to their jobs, invisible once more. The journalist who failed to ask the important questions nursed his guilt by writing down what he heard whispered on the street. He went as far as sketching out a dinosaur skeleton on a piece of notebook paper. In place of the dinosaur skull, he drew a caricature of President Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez so that a human head sat on the dinosaur's bony neck. The caption read, "Too bad the name Tyrannosaurus Rex was already taken. Tyrant Lizard King sounds just about right." To destroy the evidence, he lit the pages on fire, leaving only a small gray streak on his desk. This is what nations are built on, the journalist thought. The belief that we can bury our monstrosities underneath a pile of ash and bones. Thanks. Thanks.
Yeah, that's amazing. I read this and I just, the phrase pan y circo, bread and circus, just yeah, kind of like sealed the ending of that story for me. Yeah, this is, going back to the necessity to either, go back to the past, rewrite the past, this kind of like idea of what happened, did it really happen, who's telling the correct version. It's the T-Rex in there is just funny and absurd, but it's like it's like real. It's like that's like the crazy sad thing. And it's 6:30 in San Salvador and there's like silence, can only follow the story because I don't really know what to say other than TikTok, like here we are again.
I mean, that is definitely a theme of the book, right? It's like I'm interested in also the cyclical nature of some of the things of history, of violence, of a lot of the things I'm writing about here. And from a craft level, I was pulling on history even when it's not super obvious. So obviously for that piece, right, I was writing it at a time when I was thinking about the role of a government and a government leader who does not have the right priorities. When I wrote this other story about cyborg migrants, right? The story is set in the future, but I was thinking a lot about the sanctuary movement in the United States in the 80s. And so time on a craft level, at least, kind of in my own way, kind of falls on top of each other because I do really believe that human behavior is cyclical, and that we often repeat things we've done before. Yeah, every so often. So anyway, yeah.
That's the question that you're posing right now about time is something that I've had on my mind a lot lately as well. I had to write an essay for the Latino poetry anthology that just came out from the Library of America, and the essay is called "A Broken Clock." And the kind of like thesis that I propose is that it's so difficult for Salvadoran writers to write about the present tense because there's this constant kind of like searching back, through our parents' histories, through previous histories. And when you have the life of an immigrant, you have constantly one foot in one country and in another country, and you're trying to see like, well, what's happening over there and what's happening over here, or like you're in El Salvador, say, for a vacation, and already you're thinking, when is the next time that I'm going to come back? Am I going to be able to come back? Or, so there's this difficulty of actually staying in the present moment. And so the thesis was that the only moment that you're able to fully be present in is when you're experiencing pain, because that's the thing that actually grips you to the present moment. And so that's why so many of our poems, and the ones that are included in that anthology, and so much of this book too, has that cyclical time thing, but a lot of it is rooted in grief and loss and pain. And I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, no, that sounds right to me. Yeah, I think I'm really interested in, I mean, I'm interested in legacy, right? As a lot of writers are. And I think in El Salvador, it feels that way because everything is so interconnected, even if people don't acknowledge it. And so, like I said, I studied this stuff, right? I tried taking as a big a bird's eye, as high a bird's eye view as I could of this stuff. And it was pretty clear pretty quickly that, the US involvement in El Salvador did not start in the 80s, right? It started before that. Um, the kind of violence from La Matanza has a link to the violence of the Civil War, has a link to the violence of immigration, and of like law and order policies in the 2000s. And so everything is over interconnected and cyclical. And the uniting thing is, unfortunately, a lot of the time, this kind of violence and pain that the people are put through. Um, and so, yeah. And I guess to your point about that moment, I think the stories are often about the moment of pain, or a moment where a character has to kind of grapple with these legacies. Um, so for example, I'm thinking of my story Try Again, right, which is about a former guerrillero and his son. Um, the story is about their relationship and the really kind of immediate action of 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 the plot. I won't give too much away. But when I was thinking about the story, it was really about like, what are the impacts of the Civil War, right? Um, yeah. Anyway, so everything is connected to everything that came before. That is definitely how I feel about the world, and definitely a worldview that's reflected in the stories. Yeah.
Let's hear another alternate history.
Yeah. Which one should I do? Should I do the last one?
That one's so beautiful. I'd love for you to read that one, and then if we get a chance to hear another one, but I really don't want to miss this last one.
Yeah,
It's
let's do the
beautiful.
last one.
Yeah.
I love this one too. It's really, the first time I read it out loud, I actually got quite emotional because it is a really kind of emotional piece. And reading it unlocked something I think that even writing it hadn't. This one's also called An Alternate History of El Salvador, Perhaps the World. But this one is for Valeria and Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez. And for those listening who might recognize the names, you recognize them probably because they were two migrants who were photographed drowned in the Rio Grande, I think in 2017 or 2018. And their photograph was basically reported and reposted by every major news outlet. And so I was reflecting on that kind of extreme violence and trying to, I don't know, process that and also try to maybe offer them a little bit of hope and a little bit of the yeah, of the joy they didn't get in life. So and it's where the title of the whole collection comes from. All right. There is a Rio Grande in heaven. Oscar and Valeria must cross 1,000,000 times. It is beautiful, much more beautiful than the river on earth. The water is crystal clear. The stones in the riverbed shine like amulets. The cattails dance, bending down to touch the warm water, moving side to side so the dragonflies and bluets can zip through. It is so beautiful, and when migrants arrive at the river's edge, they think to themselves, oh, how muddy and cold, how thundering and tempestuous, how ugly and cruel the other river was. How beautiful this one is. There is a Rio Grande in heaven. It is so wide, wider than the ocean, wider than a soul. The sky and water are one. The angels are dragons and bluets or cattails dancing on the tiny bit of earth where the migrants stand. Oscar crosses the river many times, but every time, it's effortless. He backstrokes across the warm water. He builds a boat out of mud and buffalo grass and places his daughter against the hull. She laughs fizzy sparks of joy. Oscar and Valeria grow wings, sleek and strong like an albatross's, and fly across. All the other migrants follow, in strokes, in boats, with giant wings. There is a Rio Grande in heaven. It is abstract, too abstract to describe. The water is like spools and spools of cheap tulle. The birds and butterflies are like memories, dreams, desires. The stones dance like drunkards. The current flows like time. It is so abstract, and when the migrants arrive, they don't say anything. Oscar and Valeria stare at their reflections and see the 1,000,000 people they are. Dry-cheeked Ophelia, humble Icarus, victorious Captain Ahab, undrowned immigrant. They float on, far above the water, far beyond the river's edge. There is a Rio Grande in heaven. It is barely a creek. The trickle doesn't sustain much, though loose strands of wild grass poke out from the dry earth. Ladybugs and harvester ants scurry through the dirt, avoiding the migrants' footsteps. Oscar steps over the river, stretching a foot over the soft ripples. It is effortless. His daughter is perched in his arms, and they cross so easily that the river shrivels up. Everyone shuffles over the riverbed. The soles of their feet are dry, and they continue onward to their final destination. The river is an empty wound they leave behind.
That's really amazing because, like, I don't know if you've ever asked yourself, like, is heaven real? Is heaven a real place? Or like had to, do that exercise of imagining what your heaven might be like or what their heaven might be like. But it's very sensorial, and the details like the little the ladybugs, and it's just really really beautiful, because I think that, to close a book out with that kind of, you know, an injection of hope, although this is a really political collection, I think, at heart, what is at stake is human, no?
Yeah.
And I think that that's really great how you've underlined that. And I think too, another curious aspect is that, it kind of like questions it from all sides, right? Because it's not just like you know, you talk about the cyborgs, you know, the domestic cyborgs and stuff. And it's not just North Americans taking advantage of Central Americans or white people oppressing brown people. You know, it's really questioning that whole dynamic from a human point of view, because like in that story, right, it's a Latin-owned company, you
Mhm.
know, that is the oppressor. You want to talk to us a little bit about that and why that?
Yeah,
Mhm.
totally. I mean, it was just it's kind of how the world works, right? And it was a point of view or a reality that I wasn't seeing represented in fiction as often as I wanted to. And so I wanted to write about it. I wanted to write specifically about how Latinx people in the United States, especially, fail each other. Um, I think I know why, the first kind of literature that was published by Latinx people was about, the majority of it is about kind of confronting white culture, which is and white supremacy, which is a huge part of the story and, something I've experienced myself. Um, but I, when writing these stories, wanted to write about how this kind of idea of community can fall apart pretty easily. Another dynamic I was thinking a lot about was how recent immigrants tend to be mistreated by people who immigrated decades before, which is something I've seen, even Salvadorans to other Salvadorans, right? Someone who came over in the 80s can really treat a recent immigrant badly or can think them not worthy of coming or and I've heard of so many kind of wild things, unexpected things. And so I wanted to honor that. There's a story set on Mars at a detention center on Mars, and in that story, these kind of Mexican law enforcement dudes are looking out, like are chasing basically and detaining this Salvadoran American kid who feels that he deserves a right to be there. They obviously feel differently, and that's based on the real life dynamics I've seen, right? This kind of policing that happens within our community. So of course I do everything at an angle. I do everything with these kind of weird conceits. But yeah, it's just, that's how the world works, and I wanted to honor that in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've also noticed, you know, like that the way that your characters they go through these different kinds of transformations, you know, and you know, as they work their way up the ladder, and there's a lot of like references to like privilege and guilt and like questioning you know, the characters question themselves and like they consider their parents' sacrifice and you know, kind of like like how did that like idea of like, you know, what happens in each generation between like the rungs of those ladders, like, you know, how like what other elements in your stories you feel like address those kind of issues?
Yeah, I think something I've come to question a lot in the last couple of years, especially as I was writing these stories, is this question of the American dream, right? And this idea that social mobility is what we should strive for because it's, our parents sacrificed so much to give it to us. Um, which I get it. Like, it's true. It's true that people sacrifice a lot in coming to the United States, and there is this kind of pressure um, to honor that. And I don't think it's inherently bad to want to honor that sacrifice. Uh, but in the stories, I was kind of interested in what happens when we go too far in that direction, right? What happens when social mobility and kind of acquiring power and capital become the only thing that matters to someone, or the thing that matters, beyond compassion and care, um, and family. And so that is really what I was, trying to figure out. Because even though I think most people in their real lives, myself included, don't face the kind of extreme situations that I kind of come up in these stories, I think that central question is a real one. And I wanted to think about it because, yeah, I'm very conscious of the privileges I've had growing up, and in many ways, I'm the result of the American dream, like gone right, I think people would say. Uh, and yet, I think that just accepting that without questioning it would be dangerous too, because the flip side is that, someone's American dream is someone's American nightmare. This is how these things work. Yeah, so it's social mobility. It's like I had a writing teacher who was like, writers show their obsessions pretty clearly. If you read three of their stories, you know exactly what they're obsessed with. They keep coming back to it. And social mobility is one of those for me, definitely.
Yeah, I sense that. And I think that, what's really curious is that, that takes a lot of guts, a lot of guts to admit, and question that kind of privilege, no sé, like,
Yeah.
to understand, um those differences and to constantly question them. I think that's it's really brave
Yeah,
and
it's definitely
rarely seen. I think it's rarely seen.
yeah, it's definitely hard and it felt I mean, it's hard enough to do it. It's honestly a little easier to do it in my fiction than in my life, right? So so if the fiction is like a an outlet for it, that can help me do the harder work of thinking about it in my life, it felt worth it to me. Um, but I don't know. I mean, I think the story in so many ways is about questioning narratives that we take for granted. Some of them I think to certain readers can be pretty obvious, like immigrants are human, right? I can say that, and a lot of people might agree with me, but obviously we've seen there's a subset of Americans who don't fully agree with that. Um, but I wanted to also tackle stuff that was a little harder, maybe for more people to hear, which is like maybe the American dream doesn't exist. Like, let's think about that. Um, I don't know. It's yeah, it's hard, but I feel like if you're gonna spend the time and the effort and the struggle of writing, which is, time consuming and difficult and draining, it should at least tackle some hard questions. Yeah.
For sure. I think we still have time to hear another story. I don't know if you want to read a selection or if there's another flash fiction piece. And
Okay.
I want to say to anybody that's tuned in, we do have a space at the end for questions or comments from anybody listening. And if there's no questions or comments, maybe at the end, Ruben, you can just give us kind of like your general advice to writers, Salvadoran writers specifically, like, book recommendations or kind of like what to do, not to give up, you know?
Yeah, totally. Okay, let's read one that's actually fun to read out, extra fun to read out loud. It's one of the alternate histories. I will find it in a second. Um, and this one is about a disease. And I actually wrote it pre-pandemic, and then it took this whole new life after the pandemic. So, and people will see why. Okay. An untraceable disease confounds scientists and physicians all over the United States. For unknown reasons, the illness discriminates based on national origins. In hospitals from Los Angeles to New York City, Central American immigrants sport hospital gowns as they vomit into bedside pans. Only people who come from the isthmus are affected by the mysterious stomach bug. The Mexicans are fine, the Ecuadorians are fine, the Colombians are fine. The Latin American diaspora is dealing with civil conflict, refugee crises, leftist authoritarian governments, right-wing authoritarian governments, men who can't commit, secret second families, and infighting of all kinds. But only the Central Americans have the disease doctors can't crack. The disease isn't deadly. No one has died from it yet, even with reported complications related to vomiting and intestinal instability. Dehydration hasn't taken a single life. That in itself is a miracle, a doctor says on Telemundo in an attempt to assuage the quickly spreading fear. But a lot of people are sick, and a lot of people are missing work. Cities have begun crumbling. Shrubs are overgrown, dishes unwashed, and diapers unchanged. The maids and landscapers and truck drivers are stuck in uncomfortable hospital beds. Calling call, their employers can't get a hold of them at their home numbers. That's why some white people are paying attention. Some are even demanding a cure, donating their hard-earned dollars to find treatments for the disease that appears to be the work of Lucifer or Christ, depending on who you ask. Projections say that soon all the Guatemalans will have the disease, and soon all the Nicaraguans will, and eventually the Costa Ricans, until all the Guanacos and Catrachos are bedridden, their bodies hijacked by an ailment without a cure. It is not a full-blown apocalypse yet. There aren't enough people paying attention. The Central Americans are, but that's because it's Tío and Tía and Abuelita who've been taken to the hospital, many against claims that they're fine and that the stomach bug will pass, and also because they don't have health care. But lots of other people are not paying attention, even when service seems slow at the restaurants and shopping centers they frequent. The New York Times is publishing an article about the disease next week, so maybe it'll be a full-blown, hold your children close sort of crisis soon. There's no need to panic, though. There's a lot of people to do that work. Some will even do it for the same under-the-table wages, paid in cash off the books, that the Central Americans did it for before the plague swept in. Immigrants from Africa and Asia are looking for jobs. Other Latino laborers are looking for work too, so employers aren't too worried. Art galleries, nightclubs, and $3 sign Yelp restaurants will be functioning to max efficiency in no time. This is just a temporary slowdown, a malfunction in the system. The world looked, for just a moment, like it was going to fall apart because all the Salvadorans were sick. Whether or not doctors find a cure, the world will soon lift itself up and return to normalcy. It's not a pandemic, and all signs say it won't become one soon, which means the globe will keep on spinning with everyone in their rightful place. Thanks.
That's great. And it's lovely that like dark sense of humor. And did you ever see a movie called The Day Without a Mexican?
No, but that sounds
Check it,
totally up my alley.
check it out. It'll give you like a feeling of the story in a movie. It's really kind of interesting, that overlap. So why don't you give us, we only have like 5 minutes left, and I'm
Yeah.
sure like a lot of young and up and coming writers are curious, like, how did you do this? Give us some tips, give us some recommendations, just tell us.
Yeah, I think you have to first of all be a reader. You're not a reader without being a writer. And specifically for fiction writers, I will say that you need to be reading across genres. You need to be reading poets, you need to be reading nonfiction. I couldn't have written this book without the work of a ton of Salvadoran poets. And then a lot of nonfiction and academic writers, right, who gave me the basis for some of the history and the social context that I needed. So read widely is number one. The second thing I'd say is the kind of lesson that, clicked for me, luckily, I think early enough, which was that like you should write about El Salvador. You should write about the place you know. I grew up not knowing that there were Salvadoran writers, right? It took a while to find uh people who wrote about El Salvador as I knew it, or a version of El Salvador that was somewhat familiar. Uh, and that really unlocked everything for me. I think that fiction often, there's something about it's this weird thing where when you get specific, it can feel universal. Like I don't know how to explain it, but the more specific something is, the more I think a wide range of people can see themselves in it. And so write about El Salvador as you know it, if that's your experience, and a lot of people will come to it, not just Salvadorans. It'll just have a special place, I think, in a Salvi reader's heart. Um, yeah, I think those are the two big things that I would recommend specifically to a Salvadoran writer.
That's fantastic. Bueno, I hope that as part of your recommended reading that you'll pick up Ruben Reyes's book. We're going to drop the link on where to buy it right now on the chat, so that you can pick it up. I know that Ruben is also very active in his social media, and I've seen that you also read sections from your book. And so there's other ways to interact with Ruben. And I know that presently there was a comment from Muriel Asbun. She's a Salvadoran photographer. I'm not sure if you know her, Ruben, but her work is extraordinary, and she was moved by your description of refracting reality, which is really kind of relevant for her because of the visual
Yeah.
aspect of her work. So it's great that, we have this platform where, different creatives, artists, and writers can interact and learn more from each other. So I guess in addition to your recommendations, not only read a lot, but also look into Salvadoran art and focus on the kind of questions that they're asking in their work as well. I know that Tony Mena, also an artist, was tuned in, and he's having a show tomorrow night in La Sala Nacional Sala Rue that you can go check out as well. So there's constantly events here in El Salvador and also in the US. Muriel is based in DC, and she's got work up in New York. So it'd be great for you to connect with her as well, Ruben. Her work is really
Yeah.
fascinating. And so I don't know, that's pretty much it. If you want to just sign out, give us a final goodbye. I want to thank you and all of our viewers. Thank you so much for your generosity of your time. I know that, it can be taxing, all of this book promoting when, especially you've got, this novel coming out soon, but
Yeah.
we really
No,
appreciate it.
thank you. And I really appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me, and to you guys and to everyone watching and who engages with the work that you do. I know how important it is to keep the arts going, and how difficult that can feel sometimes. And so thanks for all you do. And this was just the best. Yeah, thanks.
Bueno. Good night, everybody. Stay safe. We'll see you next week. We're having an interview with Ana María Rivas. Esa presentación sí va a ser en español. Ella va a estar presentando su nuevo poemario que se llama Del Mara. Solo que vamos a comenzar a las 6:30. Entonces, ojalá nos acompañen para esa noche también. Bueno, good night, everybody.